Are the Elce Thunder Lauriston's books hiding in plain sight? The False Doctrines of Seventh-day Adventism, volumes 1 to 3. Are they really untouchable? Are they really irrefutable? According to the author, Elce Thunder Lauriston. Welcome one, welcome all to this final episode in the 2022 season of Adventist Issues and Answers. This is also a combination with the series Why I Remain a Seventh-day Adventist. I had promised this episode, and the time has come for me to do a final analysis of the 3-volume book series Hiding in Plain Sight, The False Doctrines of Seventh-day Adventism, volumes 1 to 3. Are they really untouchable? Are they really irrefutable? Come with me now as we make the final analysis. Now, it's interesting, dear listener, that in his final volume 3 of the book that you just saw on screen, Hiding in Plain Sight, the so-called The False Doctrines of Seventh-day Adventism, for the first time, Elce Thunder introduced himself in his foreword, in his introduction, as now a official practicing pastor in the United Church in Jamaica and the Cayman Islands, an official Presbyterian church in its foundation, in its background, in its doctrines. And as you can see at the bottom of the screen, he has now officially introduced himself as a practicing pastor in that church. In earlier volumes 1 and 2, he did not go that far, even though I knew that he was a pastor in training in that church. Now he apparently is an ordained pastor in the Presbyterian Church. The United Church is in Jamaica with a Presbyterian foundation. So it is a Presbyterian church, and he knows it. He cannot deny it. Now, it's interesting, dear listener, that I went to his YouTube channel, and it's interesting that his first baptism as a fully fledged Presbyterian pastor, there we see it on screen. Let me bring it up for you to see. If you're looking at the bottom of the screen, you will see he highlighted his first baptism, and among those baptized, I think, was one of his children. And interestingly, what I found very fascinating, this is just a side issue before I go into analyzing the validity of his claim that his books, the information in his books about Seventh-day Adventism, they are untouchable and irrefutable. You know, interestingly, here is he baptizing, I think, one of his children. And I found it fascinating. It's quite symbolic, but he probably doesn't even realize it. Here he's baptizing his own child in nothing else but an area where dirty water is settled. This is clearly an area where water runs through a drain. So there you can see the drains in the background. And dirty water has settled, and this is where he has chosen to baptize. Among those he was baptizing, his first baptism was his own child. Interesting. Symbolic, yes, but fascinating. There you can see the clear culverts leading drain dirty water off streets or wherever it comes from and settle. And that is where he chose to baptize his own child and others. You know, it's fascinating that sometimes we don't even realize what we're doing. But the time has come for me to put the lid on the whole affair and make one final judgment as to these books that have been put out by Elce Thunder Lauriston. What I would like to do before I analyze and give a final overall judgment and assessment of his books is to take you to his own words as he published the final volume that you're seeing on screen. Volume that I am now assessing, and hence you can see my pictures on the side as I'm about to assess this book or these books and give my final verdict after carefully reading and studying them out. Let me now take you to his own presentation as he published this book online. Now, in order for me to have you hear it clearly, I will have it run in the background, but I will amplify the sound so you can hear him a little better. Here we go.
Hey everybody, good evening, good morning, good afternoon, in whichever part of the world you may be in right now. This is your boy Pastor Thunder. I just wanted to stop by real quick to announce that Hiding in Plain Sight, The False Doctrines of Seventh-day Adventism, Volume 3, the final volume in the series, is fully published now. It's out. It's available in both Kindle as well as paperback format. And so please feel free to check it out. I'll leave the link for it in the description box. You can get it on Amazon. And I tell you, you're in for a great surprise. If you think Volume 1 and Volume 2 were mind-blowing beyond what you anticipated or imagined, this one is going to blow everything out of the water. It's going to blow everything out of the water. I've dealt with some critical and embarrassing issues that Adventists and SD apologists like to try to spin and avoid and run around. Yes, amalgamation of man and beast, Ellen White fail and false prophecies of the second coming and so many other things. I've also dealt with her racism, black and white issues, interracial marriages, the list goes on. And of course I deal with the state of man, the state of death, eternal conscious punishment. The book is beyond what you could imagine, especially the sections where I deal with critical issues about Ellen White, her contradictions of scripture, of herself, and tons of other things. So feel free to get it. It's the final nail in the coffin, as I told you before. After I finish these definitive, thorough, and exhaustive volumes, I'll be stepping back from apologetics dealing with SDAs, as I'm in full-time pastoral ministry now, and so I don't have the time anymore. But I'm grateful that God could have given me the strength and the resources to produce these for you, the wider public, so that you can use as tools and resources to be correctly taught the gospel and for it to be defended contra SDA doctrines and the ramblings of these mindless, pointless SDA apologists. I've watched their videos, I read their write-ups. They are nonsensical, and so I'm not going to waste an inch of my time, a moment of my time, even addressing them or responding to them. They are pointless. The books are there, and they will do the work for themselves. The books are a combined total of 980 pages. These guys are using half a sentence, producing 2 hour videos, hour and a half, and thinking they're refuting anything. We watch them. People are comparing the information, the argumentation, the approach, the scholarship, and the lack thereof on their part, and the scholarship that I've exhibited in my books, and they come to their conclusions. And at the end of the day, the information is irrefutable. The information is untouchable. That's why they try so hard to attack me as a person, my character, and to demean my works and what have you. But hey, the books are speaking for themselves. They are doing the work. The care, the critical scholarship, the thoroughness, it's there doing its work for any well-thinking person to read for themselves. And so, let them keep ranting. That is their problem. The books are there, they're published now, and they're always going to be there to do the work. So check them out, guys. God bless y'all. Ever so often, I'll probably drop by, maybe to post a sermon or something. But as I said before, I'm not going to be engaging in anti-SD apologetics anymore. Here and there, perhaps an interview where somebody needs a seminar or something. But I am extremely busy now as I'm shifting focus into full-time pastoral ministry. I've already started, and that's what I'm going to be doing for now. So God bless you all. Happy reading, and continue to place your faith in Jesus Christ and to not let yourself be deceived by the false doctrines of Seventh-day Adventism. I wish for you a wonderful day.
All right, so dear listener, there you have it. Elce Lauriston has declared that his books, the information contained in the 3-volume books, Hiding in Plain Sight, the False Doctrines of Seventh-day Adventism, according to him, of course, they are irrefutable, they are untouchable. He made plain that the books are forever there to do the work of, according to him, undermine and deconstruct the false doctrines of Seventh-day Adventism. But you know, it's interesting. After having read through these books myself, one thing I can say, and I will tell you this, I am grateful for the fact that Elce Thunder has skimmed through the very many anti-Seventh-day Adventist pieces of literature that are out there. He has gathered together what may be considered the strongest arguments from the critics, from the opposers of Seventh-day Adventism. And so this book has done its job of presenting to me, a Seventh-day Adventist, what might be considered the most potent of all the arguments that can be gathered against Seventh-day Adventism. And so for this, I am thankful to Elce Thunder Lauriston, because the book is doing that work of having me being forced to face up to and dig deeper into the issues that are related to Seventh-day Adventism. But you know, the interesting thing is, he may explain that this book contains information, these books rather, contain information that are irrefutable, they are untouchable, he may explain. And there you can see the final volume and the chapters that are related, as he mentioned in his short video advertisement of the final volume, volume 3. He dealt with the issue of death, he dealt with the issue of hell and how humans will be punished ultimately. He went into some of the controversial issues related to Ellen White in terms of amalgamation of man and beast, and some of her so-called false doctrines or false prophecies and teachings that contradict the Bible and herself and so forth. And as you can see, he may explain that Seventh-day Adventism, as you can see in part 4 of volume 3, he dealt with also the matter of alcoholic beverages and wine and so forth. He even went as far as accusing Mrs. White of racism against the blacks and all of that. And you know, these are issues that I have delved into for very many years, long before Elce Thunder joined the Seventh-day Adventist Church just a few years ago, and within a few years he left it. I have been studying out these issues in detail for very many years. And what this book has done for me is that it has reinforced what are some of the most potent arguments that, or seemingly potent arguments, that can be leveled against Seventh-day Adventism. And after carefully analyzing both sides of the issue, the strongest arguments that can be put together by the critics, which is what Elce Thunder has done in these 3 volumes. And after looking at the issues carefully and the other side of the arguments, in other words, how Adventism has defended itself over the years, I have come to the conclusion that this 3-volume book series has done nothing more than what I presented in my earlier videos in response to these books. Nothing more, but simply regurgitated and recaptured and reiterated the position of the critics. It has presented nothing new, nothing that has floored me, nothing that has caused me any real concern. Why? Because I have been studying out these issues carefully, and I have looked at the other side of the arguments and know that Elce Thunder's books, they have failed to move me. I can't speak for anybody else, but having carefully analyzed the issues from both sides of the fence, I can clearly say that Elce Thunder has done a wonderful job of regurgitation, reiteration, pulling together the popular and common arguments out there. But once you know the facts, he has done nothing to make me change my stance or my position, because simply put, his books, they are not, contrary to his own opinion, they are not untouchable, neither are they irrefutable. And I'm now going to take you step by step, dear listener, to give you a couple examples, because there's no way within an hour or so I can delve into every issue. But I've been giving you bits and pieces of my responses in earlier videos to show you why Elce Thunder, despite his claim that, I am a mindless, empty-headed apologist who is just rambling on and my responses are pointless. Well, there are many persons who have been listening and they recognize that Elce Thunder himself has been refuted several times in these few videos that have been put out, showing clearly that these books are in no way untouchable or irrefutable as he claims. Now let's look at a couple of examples. Alright, so let's first of all address, dear listener, what is obviously the biggest issue that would be on the table as it concerns a book put out by former Seventh-day Adventist Elce Thunder Lauriston against the Seventh-day Adventist Church. It obviously would have to be the key issue of the Sabbath. Is this book, or are these books, untouchable and irrefutable? Well, if we should go by Elce Thunder's own church that he is now a practicing pastor in, baptizing members in his own family and others into this church, as he is now a full-fledged, obviously ordained Presbyterian minister in the Hampden United Churches in Jamaica and the Cayman Islands in the Caribbean. If we should go by his own church, we would realize that Elce Thunder is in a serious pickle. He's in a serious bind because his own church, as I have shown in past videos, ironically teaches that the Sabbath continues to be binding. The 10 Commandments continues to be binding. The founder of Elce Thunder's own Presbyterian church declared this to be the truth. The present Presbyterian churches all over the world declare this to be true. You know what is fascinating? Elce Thunder is baptizing members into this church, and yet he is totally opposed to the teaching that the 10 Commandments are still binding, that the Sabbath is still binding. And you know what is hypocritical about this is that he is now obviously on the payroll or maybe the staff of the Presbyterian churches. And yet he's teaching the total opposite of what that church teaches, and he's now baptizing members into that church. That church teaches that the Ten Commandments are still binding, they are forever binding, they are eternal, and that includes the Sabbath. And Elce found they cannot deny it, because I have shown it repeatedly, over and over. And the interesting thing is that he himself has taught that there is no way that Sunday, the keeping of Sunday, can be said to be the new Christian Sabbath, because he himself teaches that Sunday and the Sabbath are two separate things, and one Sunday cannot be considered the Christian Sabbath that has now replaced or is now filling the role of being the Sabbath of the Ten Commandments. What does that leave Elce Thunder with? A position of hypocrisy, where he is now practicing, pastoring in a church that teaches the total opposite of what he himself teaches. And yet, he is going to try to castigate the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Problems, big problems. Let's look at the other issue of the matter of tithes and offerings. Elce Thunder says that tithes have been abolished with the old covenant, and yet his own church, the Hampden Church and the Presbyterian churches, continue to practice tithing as an obligation of the Christian. Not just offerings, but tithes, as I showed earlier in a video, an earlier video. Big problems, because here is a practicing pastor saying that tithes have been abolished along with the old covenant, and yet, as one of the duties of a Christian, the Presbyterian churches, including the Hampden United Church in Jamaica and the Cayman Islands, continues to practice tithing as an obligatory Christian duty. Problems. Book is irrefutable, untouchable. Interestingly, I find it to be otherwise. Let's look at, for instance, in his latest book, volume 3, he touches on the issue of death. And he says that the Adventist teaching that, death is a sleep of the soul, the entire being, that this is a false doctrine, and that when you die, your body dies, but your spirit is in heaven, and therefore the real you is up there in heaven, awaiting the resurrection, where you will put on a new body. But the real you is in heaven. And he went at length to regurgitate and reiterate the popular view out there in the vast majority of churches, Christendom, that when you die, you are not really dead in the sense of you no longer exist as a person or as a being, but just your body is dead, but your spirit is alive, and you, the real person, conscious, living being, is in heaven. And as I looked at, how he unites this with the popular view of hellfire, and how humans will roast and be tormented in fire, conscious and non-stop for all eternity. Yet when I study the Bible, here's what I simply see. It is made plain that David is not in heaven. That was made plain, that his grave is with the Jews, and he has not yet ascended to heaven. Now, if David was the real being in spirit, if his spirit after death was the real being, the real person. There's no way that the Bible could say that David has not ascended to heaven, but he's with us up to this very day in his sepulchre. If according to Elce Thunder, eternal fire would mean that humans and demons would continue to consciously roast in hell and cannot die, then there is no way that the Bible could use hellfire as the symbol in the book of Revelation for death and the grave would be no more. The Bible may explain that death and hell, which is the grave, would be cast in the lake of fire. Now, if according to Elce Thunder, hell is a place of continuous conscious existence and you continue to exist for eternity while being tormented, then it is obvious that in Ezekiel chapter 28, where the Bible may explain that the devil would be reduced to ashes and he would be no more, and death and suffering and hell, the grave, would be defeated and would be no more. Now, if the eternal burning lake of fire, according to the popular teaching that Elce Thunder is regurgitating, would mean that humans would continue to exist for all eternity in this state of conscious existence, then that would mean the same for Satan. Very Satan that Bible says he would be no more in Ezekiel chapter 28. Death and the grave would continue to exist despite the Bible and Jesus may explain that there will be no more. So it's a case of you can't have your cake and eat it. Elce Thunder is simply regurgitating the popular views out there, and yet when you carefully study the Bible, you see something else. Elce Thunder says, for instance, that in the new earth, the Sabbath would have already long been abolished and there would be no Sabbath. Yet his own church is presently teaching. The Presbyterian churches are teaching that in the earth made new, the Sabbath will return and will be kept by all the saved of earth, which I have already proven carefully and shown you plainly in earlier videos. Now, what will it be? Sunday that will return? The very same Sunday that Elce Thunder may explain is not the biblical Sabbath. So if it is Sunday which is not the biblical Sabbath that will return, then the question is, how come his own church is teaching that it is the seventh day Sabbath of the Ten Commandments that will return, and yet Elce Thunder is saying the total opposite of what his own church is teaching in terms of the principles of the Ten Commandments always being there and will be kept even in the earth made new. Let's look, for instance, at Elce Thunder's claim that Ellen White, for instance, always taught that Jesus was a created being, a created angel, and therefore she was an Aryan. And as I have proved earlier, early Adventist pioneers, some of them had this view. But if you scour the writings of Ellen White, you will see nowhere where she taught that Jesus was a created angel and he is not God in the highest sense. I have shown clearly otherwise, that Ellen White has taught the very same thing that Trinitarians have taught for very many centuries, that Jesus is the begotten Son of the Father from eternity, just as we saw, which was the issue at the Council of Nicaea. Jesus was begotten of the Father, and yet he has always existed from all eternity, God of God, and yet he's God in the highest sense, the Lord our God, Jehovah himself, since our God is not just the Father, but is also the Son and is also the Spirit. I have shown clearly that Elce Thunder has blundered seriously on that issue of what Ellen White actually teaches about Jesus being our God. And dear listener, there are so many issues I could go into to show you clearly that Elce Thunder, his books are far from being irrefutable or untouchable. Now, he says that the books are there that will, lead any well-thinking person to recognize the false doctrines of Seventh-day Adventism. Well, it's interesting, that when you carefully analyze the arguments that he uses, you realize that it is only someone who has not carefully studied both sides of the issue would have been misled by his arguments. He says, for instance, let's look at an example. He says, for instance, Ellen White taught that, animals and humans were amalgamated to create an inferior race of blacks. Yet, if you read through Ellen White's writings, you will never find that. You will find what appears to the mind of some readers who don't carefully analyze Ellen White's writings to think that that is so. And he uses the argument that yes, the pioneers, they voted on Uriah Smith's explanation of Ellen White's writings on the issue. But it's interesting that Elce Thunder failed to look at when Ellen White's own son addressed the issue of amalgamation of man and beast. And he flat out denied that Ellen White taught that blacks were the result of humans and animals uniting by bestiality. Yes, some early Adventist pioneers had this mistaken view. So what? Let's look, for instance, at the Bible. When you use examples in the Bible to counter his arguments, he makes it plain that you are denigrating the Bible. Well, the Bible is the best example you can compare anything with. So let's look at an example of how the Bible itself can be misunderstood even by God's own people. The Jews, for instance, up to this present moment, you go to the Jewish encyclopedia, they are teaching in it that the earth is flat. And they quote prophets galore in the Old Testament, which seem to say that the earth is flat. And when you read very many passages, it does appear that it may be just what the prophets were saying. Yet we now know from concrete, irrefutable scientific evidence that the world is a sphere, a ball-like object. Now, the Jews testified in their writings that they understood the prophets of old in the Old Testament to be teaching that the earth is flat. And if you read some of the writings of the prophets in the Bible, it does appear to, it seemed that way. The question is, why is it that the Bible never, both in the Old and New Testament, never corrected this false impression that the Jews, the people of God themselves, have thought that the earth is flat? Why? Is it saying that this is really what God intended to teach, that the earth is flat? Because it seemed to have been what the prophets were saying in the Old Testament. That's how it can appear when certain issues are controversial. Ellen White never gave any final statement on the issue. And the very same way that the people of God understood the prophets to be saying that the earth is flat, and yet they are wrong. The early pioneers understood that this is what Ellen White meant, and yet they were wrong. Because Ellen White never explained it that way. And her son, who was very close to her when the issues came to a head, fully explained that Ellen White did not agree with this viewpoint of Uriah Smith and others, and she never taught that the blacks were the result of amalgamation of man and beast. It's interesting that one of the apocryphal books that Elce Thunder love to push up as if they are inspired. One of the apocryphal books does give the view that the Jews had this understanding that there were two forms of amalgamation in the time of the flood, or just before the flood. amalgamation of God's race of righteous people and the descendants of Cain who were unrighteous. And then they had another view of animals that were united genetically to create hybrids, that these were two forms of amalgamation. And it's interesting that that view existed among the Jews. And I am convinced that this is exactly what Ellen White was explaining as well. Two forms of amalgamation described in such a way that if you're a careless reader, you can misunderstand. Just like all the Jews, God's own people, misunderstand their own Bible, their own literature, to think that the earth is flat. And that's what the prophets were teaching all along. Telling you clearly that the issue is still controversial. There is no slam dunk that Elce Thunder has done against Adventism in terms of what he may think. And I could go on and on and on like that, dear listener. But I tell you what, I'm not going to spend hours trying to address every single case, every single point that he has raised publicly in his books. Anyone can contact me. Any issue you feel to raise about the issues that were raised in Elce Thunder's 3 volumes, and ask me to give you an answer from the Seventh-day Adventist perspective. And you will realize why I'm now saying that Elce Thunder's books, they are far from untouchable. They are far from irrefutable. And in fact, they prove that, contrary to his claim that, the books were careful in their scholarship and so, far from it. For instance, he claims that because God's people, the Jews, for many years were wearing jewelry, and God even used jewelry to show that his people, the bride of Christ, were dressed like a Eastern bride in jewelry, that indicates that nothing is wrong with wearing jewelry. Shows clear short-sightedness as a scholar, as a pastor. I mean, think about this. In the New Testament, God shows clearly that he was bringing his people back to the original of one wife, one man, one woman. And yet throughout the Old Testament, you see polygamy dominating the Old Testament, and God even using more than one wife to illustrate his blood children of Abraham and his spiritual children through Jesus. 2 separate wives. And yet, God's ideal is one wife. One man, one woman. The Jews practiced slavery. I mean, slavery is so frowned upon today as one of the most inhumane things against humanity. And yet, the people of Israel were dominated by the practice of slavery for very many centuries. God even used a servant or a slave to represent his own Messiah, his own chosen people. The same word used for servant and same word used for slave. And we would frown upon slavery today, but yet God used this to symbolize his people, to symbolize his Messiah. Could it be that during the time of the Jews, they were not perfect, the Old Testament Jews? They were not perfect. They were not experiencing the ideal in everything. But God was working with them through their everyday experiences to step by step bring them to what he wanted them to be. That's what I see. In the New Testament, we see instructions to avoid jewelry. And yet in the Old Testament, we see God using jewelry to symbolize his people as being blessed. So what? It's the same thing we see with slavery. It's the same thing we see with polygamy. God used what existed in their experience at the time to teach lessons, but then step by step he was leading them to a higher level of experience. So that today, slavery is obviously not God's will for humanity. And that's why the Christian church has frowned upon it and has abolished it. Yet it dominated the Christian Bible and even represented our Messiah, represented God's people as slaves. And of course, Elce Thunder continues to make the blunder of thinking that all the views and opinions of the Jews, they are correct. And so he reels off quotations from the Apocrypha and from uninspired writings of the Jews to prove points and cases. Well, I've learned long ago that the hidden books that are not inspired, compared to the Bible, not the way to go. Not the way to go at all. And so he makes a claim that, all I have done is to pick sentences here and there and a line here and there and build responses around them. Well, it's easy to do because it doesn't matter how many chapters and pages are dedicated to a false teaching or a false claim. It can be summarized in one sentence and that one sentence be responded to. I'll give you a classic example. He makes plain that the Roman Catholic Church never existed until after 1054, when the Eastern and Western churches separated. And so therefore there was no Roman Catholic Church until 1054. Well, you take up history books, experts at Roman Catholicism, and you find that that's not the case. Many experts recognize that the Catholic Church started to develop from in the 3rd and 4th century, in fact from the 2nd century onwards. And so while it was in union with Eastern churches, the Greek churches, the Roman Church was having a strong influence and in fact was on the scene long before Elce Thunder thinks. Now here's an interesting thing. Jews, for instance, properly speaking, are considered when Israel as a nation was separated and the 12 tribes were broken apart, and you have the tribe of Judah as one of the 12 tribes. And yet you will notice Jews and Israel were represented by the tribe of Judah from the very beginning, when they were united as 12 tribes. The entire nation was still called Judah, Jews, Israel. And so Israel was there from the very beginning, long before there was a separation of the 12 tribes. Rome was there from the very beginning, long before there was the schism of the 11th century. And so Elce Thunder thinks that, he has done a slam dunk. And as I continue to read his writings and realize the mess that he has made. Yes, it will fool those who don't think carefully. It will fool those who don't think critically or don't analyze the issues carefully. But it's not going to fool me. I have to stop here because I have studied all 3 books. I have gone into every issue that he has raised. In volume 1, he dealt with the matter of Adventism's teaching on the investigative judgment, Adventism's teaching on Jesus as Michael the Archangel in a symbolic way. He has looked at the issue of tithes and offerings and Ellen White as a prophet, and in volume 2 he continued the issues And I have looked at every issue that he has raised. In volume 3, I have also looked at the issues. And I've realized where every issue can be responded to. And that is why my final verdict, dear listener, is that Elce Thunder's 3-volume books, and in fact all the other books that he has presented against Adventism, they are not irrefutable, neither are they untouchable. That's his ploy, to sell his books. Yes, the books are always going to be there to do the work. What kind of work? To give him royalties right up until his old age. Yes, the books have been written, and they will be selling to those who are opposed to Adventism, those who the ready market is out there to find arguments against Adventism. So yes, these books will be putting money in Elce Thunder's pockets for years to come. So they will be there doing that work. They will also be there doing the work of misleading. But they can't fool me. They will not fool me. And so, as I close the year 2022, December 31, I am now presenting this book as my final response to Elce Thunder. Yes, I have not addressed all the issues, but I have addressed enough to show that contrary to his claim, they are not irrefutable, neither are they untouchable. And if there be any issue that I have not touched, that anyone would like to have me touch, feel free to contact me. Raise issues with me in a private email, or contact me through Facebook, or contact me on YouTube. And I will be more than happy to show you why Elce Thunder has not convinced me. His books, they might appear to him to be so careful in scholarship, but they are not. A lot they have overlooked, a lot they have missed, a lot they have misinterpreted, a lot they have misrepresented. And just the same way that the Bible can be misunderstood, misrepresented, misinterpreted by so many, even by God's own Jewish people. And yet, the truth can be otherwise. That's where I stand. And until somebody can come up with something better than what Elce Thunder has done, gleaning all of the arguments of the critics over the years, here I stand. I remain a Seventh-day Adventist because I see the validity of the Seventh-day Adventist teachings and doctrines. And all that can be claimed to be false teachings and contradictions and false prophecies and so forth. Same way you would have to take the time to look at the Bible and analyze what it says despite the misrepresentations of it. It's the same thing that can be done with Seventh-day Adventism. And so, for instance, as I close, many people read this statement in the Bible which says God creates all things, creates evil and he creates good. And some people take that to mean that God is the creator of everything that's evil, suffering and death and Satan, and obviously that's not what it means. But that is how many people misunderstand the statement of the Bible. Not recognizing that every time God spoke about evil that he creates, it was in direct reference to the punishments that he would bring upon the Jews if they failed to obey him. This is the evil that God was talking about. And when you check the history of God's reference to the punishments that would come upon the nation of Israel because of their disobedience and their falling into sin and idol worship and so, God promised that he would punish them with other nations that would enslave them and capture them, and that is what God meant when he said he would send evil or create evil for their good. Nothing else. And so I close, dear listener, with one final statement. Things are not always as they appear. I've been saying this from 2016 when I have been responding to Elce Thunder in so many ways. He totally disregards my responses, and he feels that I am not scholarly enough with credentials to my name and abilities in Greek and Hebrew and textual analysis to be able to respond to him. Well, if he wants to ignore me, fine. I have no issues with that. He's free to do so. But I am doing this because at the end of the day, if one person will benefit from my response, I would have done what God has called me to do. And it also demonstrates my own testimony as to why, despite all the challenges, despite all of the misrepresentations, despite all of the lies, despite all of the charges that are leveled against Seventh-day Adventism by Elce Thunder and whosoever else, I will remain a Seventh-day Adventist. Thank you for listening. God bless.